Chains rattled in the dead of night, echoing against the walls of a coal furnace. 14 plantation masters, once feared and untouchable, now trembled like animals caught in a trap. Flames roared, hissing louder with every log thrown in. The air smelled of sweat, smoke, and terror. At the center stood a woman, once their slave, now their executioner. Her name was Esperanza de Lima, and in 1716, she turned fire into vengeance. But how did this moment of burning revenge begin? The story of Esperanza de Lima begins not in Peru, where her vengeance would one day shake the earth, but far across the Atlantic, on the sunlit coasts of West Africa. She was born around 1680, in a small village near the mouth of the Congo River. Her people thrived by the rhythm of rivers, fishing, farming, and trading. Children laughed under tall palms, elders told stories by firelight, and families passed down traditions older than empires. For 12 years, Esperanza lived in this world of freedom. Her African name is lost to history, erased, silenced, but her spirit would not be forgotten. One morning, when the sun had barely risen, the peace of her village was shattered. Armed men stormed in, slave raiders who had allied with European traders. Houses burned, smoke choked the sky, and terrified screams filled the air. Esperanza, still a child, was bound in chains along with dozens of others. Mothers were torn from children, husbands from wives. Those who resisted were slaughtered. Esperanza's wrists bled as iron shackles dug into her skin, her childhood ending in a single day. Dragged to the coast, she was forced onto a ship bound for the Americas. The Middle Passage was a nightmare beyond imagination. Packed into the dark hold with hundreds of other captives, Esperanza endured filth, starvation, disease, and the constant stench of death. Bodies were tossed overboard when life slipped away, the sea becoming a graveyard. The sound of chains, the cries of the dying, and the cruel laughter of sailors etched themselves into her memory forever. After months at sea, only a fraction of those who boarded survived. Esperanza was one of them. The ship docked in Cartagena, Colombia, one of Spain's busiest slave ports. Here, she was sold like livestock, examined for strength, teeth, and scars. Bidders shouted prices while terrified children clung to their mothers. Esperanza was purchased by the de Lima family, wealthy Spanish colonists who owned sugar and coal plantations in northern Peru. She was renamed Esperanza, the Spanish word for hope. It was a cruel joke, for her new life offered none. The plantation was a sprawling kingdom of suffering. Endless fields of sugarcane stretched toward the horizon, their sharp leaves slicing into the skin of those forced to harvest them. At the center of the estate stood the great house of the de Limas, built with white stone and arrogance. Behind it roared the coal furnace, its iron mouth devouring fuel day and night. Slaves worked under its heat until they collapsed, their sweat soaking the earth. The overseers ensured no one forgot their chains. Whips cracked like thunder, and the smallest mistake was punished with blood. Esperanza was placed under the direct control of Mistress Isabella de Lima, a woman as cruel as she was vain. Draped in silks and jewels imported from Spain, Isabella saw herself as the queen of the plantation. To her, slaves were not people but animals, creatures to command and degrade. She took a particular delight in tormenting Esperanza, perhaps because the young girl's spirit still glimmered in her eyes. Isabella mocked her accent, slapped her for hesitating, and ordered punishments for imagined slights. Once, for failing to bow low enough, Esperanza was whipped until her back bled raw. Yet even more feared than Isabella was Hernando de Lima, the master himself. Cold and calculating, Hernando believed cruelty was discipline. He measured human worth by profit and labor. When a man was caught resting during harvest, Hernando ordered him chained to a post in the sun without water until death claimed him. Another time, when a group of slaves tried to pray secretly, Hernando had the leader buried alive in the sugar fields. His message was clear: obedience or annihilation. Esperanza's days were consumed by labor. At dawn, she was driven into the cane fields, her bare feet cut and bleeding from sharp stalks. At noon, overseers forced her to stoke the coal furnace, shoveling fuel into its fiery maw until her arms shook with exhaustion. At night, she collapsed on the dirt floors of slave quarters, surrounded by the whispers of grief and despair. Hunger gnawed constantly, clothing was ragged, and the air reeked of sweat and ash. Yet through all this, Esperanza's mind remained sharp, her heart steady. She endured, but she never surrendered. What kept her alive was not hope for kindness from her masters. It was the quiet flame of resistance growing inside her. She watched. She listened. She learned. She noted when guards grew lazy, when keys were left too close, when locks rusted. She studied the furnace, how its iron doors sealed, how its flames roared, how it could consume anything. To others, it was an engine of labor. To Esperanza, it was a weapon waiting to be turned against her oppressors. Among her fellow slaves, Esperanza gained respect. She was young, but her strength and unbroken will inspired others. When children cried, she comforted them with whispers of better days. When men groaned from beatings, she tended their wounds with scraps of herbs gathered in the fields. At night, when the overseer's shadows retreated, she whispered dreams of freedom. Some called her reckless for even speaking such thoughts, but others listened. Whispers grew. Esperanza will not bow forever. Esperanza is different. Still, punishment stalked her constantly. One Christmas Eve, while the masters feasted on roasted meats and fine wine, the slaves were given scraps, a mockery of celebration. Esperanza, accused of stealing extra bread, was dragged by Isabella and chained near the roaring furnace as punishment. The heat blistered her skin, burning her arms, the smoke filling her lungs until she coughed blood. All night she remained shackled there, on the edge of death. By dawn, her arms bore scars that would never fade. Isabella laughed, thinking she had broken her spirit. But that night did not break Esperanza. It remade her. As the flames scorched her skin, she stared into the furnace and imagined her masters inside it. She imagined their screams replaced the roar of fire, their flesh feeding the same flames they had forced her to tend. What nearly killed her also gave her a vision. One day, the furnace would no longer be her prison. It would be their grave. Over the years, this vision grew sharper. She bided her time, enduring cruelty, swallowing rage, waiting for the perfect moment. She knew open rebellion was nearly impossible. Those who tried were slaughtered, their bodies left hanging as warnings. Yet Esperanza's patience was her strength. She would not strike until her enemies were gathered, until their arrogance blinded them completely. And that chance was coming. By 1715, the de Lima plantation was thriving, and Hernando and Isabella planned a grand feast to display their wealth. They invited neighboring plantation owners, 14 masters in all, along with their wives and overseers. They would drink, boast, and gorge themselves in a night of decadence, never imagining the eyes of a slave were watching them with fire in her soul. Esperanza's scars burned as she stoked the furnace for that feast, her mind sharpening into resolve. The masters had taught her pain, but also patience. They had given her chains, but also a weapon. Every insult, every lash, every night of suffering had prepared her for what was to come. The girl who once wept in chains was gone. In her place stood a woman who carried fire in her veins. What she would do next would shake the world of masters and slaves alike. By 1710, Esperanza had spent nearly 2 decades in bondage on the Lima plantation. Her body was strong, her back lined with scars, her spirit hardened like iron. But the cruelty around her grew heavier with each passing year. What had once been the pain of childhood had turned into the bitter endurance of adulthood. The longer she lived, the more clearly she saw the plantation not as a farm, but as a machine designed to crush the human soul. The sugarcane fields were endless, stretching beneath the burning Peruvian sun. At dawn, overseers blew horns, dragging men, women, and even children into the fields. Each stalk of cane was as sharp as a blade, cutting into skin as it was hacked down with machetes. Blood stained the fields as surely as dew. Overseers carried whips, their lashes tearing open backs until the ground itself seemed to drink red. It was a rhythm of cruelty. Cut, bleed, sweat, whip. No rest, no mercy. When slaves collapsed, overseers shouted, "Get up or be left for dead." Among the overseers, one name carried particular terror: Rodrigo, a broad-shouldered brute with a taste for cruelty. He was a drunkard, his breath always sour with cheap rum, his eyes red and wild. Rodrigo hated Esperanza more than most. Perhaps it was because she never screamed the way he wanted when he beat her. Perhaps it was because she held his gaze with defiance rather than fear. To break her spirit became his obsession. He whipped her without cause, sometimes dragging her into the fields just to see her bleed. Once, when Esperanza slowed from exhaustion, he tied her hands to a post and lashed her until the whip string split apart. Her back became a canvas of blood and scars, and still she did not beg. The other slaves whispered that she was not of flesh, but of stone. Rodrigo, enraged that he could not break her, promised, "One day, I'll bury you alive myself." The cruelty of the Lima family was no less monstrous. Mistress Isabella continued to take pleasure in humiliation. She forced Esperanza to polish her shoes until her knees bled on stone floors, mocked her scars as ugly decorations, and once, during a feast, ordered Esperanza to crawl under the table to clean spilled wine while the guests laughed and kicked at her. Hernando de Lima, cold and methodical, believed terror was the only way to maintain order. He would often line slaves up to watch executions. A thief was hanged from a tree for stealing dried meat. Another, caught praying in secret, was buried alive while the others were forced to pack the soil with their bare hands. Esperanza pressed her palms into the dirt that night, her nails snapping, her heart burning with rage. Every cruelty engraved itself into her memory like iron letters in stone. For the slaves, even days of celebration were poisoned. On Christmas, while the masters held feasts of roasted pig and overflowing wine, the slaves were given scraps, forced to sing hymns for their captors' amusement. On New Year's Day, instead of joy, overseers administered lashings, claiming it was tradition to begin the year with discipline. For Esperanza, these days of false festivity were reminders that even joy itself was stolen. Yet Esperanza endured. And more than that, she remembered. Her scars became not symbols of defeat, but fuel for vengeance. When Rodrigo mocked her burned arms, she touched the scars with pride. They were proof she had survived what should have killed her. Each lash of the whip, each cruel command, each insult from Isabella, each punishment ordered by Hernando, they were debts. Debts that would one day be paid. Still, rebellion was a death sentence. Esperanza had seen the aftermath of failed uprisings. Rumors reached the plantation of slaves who poisoned their masters' wine with crushed herbs, or who lit fields aflame to spark chaos. When discovered, the rebels were tortured, hanged, or dismembered. Their bodies were displayed as warnings. Fear hung over the slaves like a second chain. To even speak of resistance was to risk death. And yet Esperanza, in whispers beneath the cover of night, began to speak. She told others of her vision, though never too openly. One day, the furnace will not burn us, it will burn them. Most shook their heads, too afraid. Some begged her to stop before she drew suspicion. But a few, those who had lost everything, listened with fire in their eyes. Quietly, Esperanza gathered them. Not in great numbers, but enough. a handful of allies willing to risk everything. They would not strike blindly. They would wait. They would endure. And when the moment came, they would be ready. That moment inched closer in 1715, when Hernando de Lima announced a grand celebration. The plantation had grown richer than ever, its sugar-filling ships bound for Spain. To boast of his success, Hernando invited neighboring plantation owners to a great feast. 14 masters, with their wives and overseers, were to attend. They would eat, drink, and revel in their wealth, surrounded by the very slaves who built it. It would be a night of arrogance, decadence, and cruelty disguised as festivity. For Esperanza, it was the spark. Never before had so many masters gathered under one roof, unguarded, intoxicated, blind in their pride. She felt her scars burn with a new fire. The thought struck her with clarity. The furnace, the same that had nearly cooked her alive, could become the perfect weapon. It was vast, its iron doors strong, its flames hungry. If she could lead the masters to it, chain them as they had chained her people, and seal them inside, the fire would do the rest. Still, the risks were staggering. If caught, she and her allies would be tortured, slaughtered, erased from history. Fear whispered that it was impossible. But vengeance whispered louder, "This is the moment. This is the chance." Esperanza had waited years for such an opportunity. She would not let it pass. And so she began to plan, weaving her vengeance in silence. She watched the overseer's habits more closely than ever. She memorized where chains and locks were kept, when guards grew drunk, when the furnace blazed hottest. She whispered to her chosen allies, swearing them to secrecy. She fed her fury into patience, into preparation. Every lash, every insult, every drop of blood spilled on the plantation became another stone in the foundation of her revenge. By the eve of the feast, Esperanza's heart was a storm. She served the masters with bowed head, but inside she felt only fire. As she stoked the furnace that night, the flames roared higher, reflecting in her eyes. The overseers laughed and drank. The masters feasted on roasted meats while the slaves bent in service. The air reeked of wine, sweat, and arrogance. Esperanza's moment had come. And what she was about to do would not only change her fate, it would send shivers of fear through every plantation in the Americas. The night of the great feast arrived in 1716, heavy with heat, smoke, and the arrogance of men who believed themselves untouchable. The De Lima plantation glowed with torchlight, the grand house decorated in silks, the dining tables laden with roasted meats, fruits, and jugs of wine imported from Spain. 14 plantation masters, accompanied by their wives and overseers, gathered to boast, to laugh, to drink. They carried with them the stench of power, the knowledge that their wealth was built upon chains and suffering. For the enslaved, the night was another performance of servitude. They moved silently, carrying trays of food and pitchers of wine, bowing under the weight of arrogance. But for Esperanza, this was no ordinary night. It was the culmination of years of torment, patience, and planning. Beneath her bowed head and quiet steps, her heart beat with fury. The furnace roared in the distance, its flames a reminder of both her scars and her vision. Esperanza had spent months preparing. She had chosen her allies carefully, men and women who had nothing left to lose. There was Mateo, whose wife had been beaten to death by Rodrigo the overseer. Isabel, who carried burns from being punished in boiling water. And Diego, whose son had been hanged for attempting escape. Each carried their own scars, their own debts. Together, they swore loyalty to Esperanza's vision, to make the furnace their master's grave. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. The masters would be lured toward the furnace, perhaps under the guise of a late-night spectacle or demonstration. Chains, prepared in advance, would bind them. Once trapped inside, the doors would be sealed, and the fire would consume them. It was madness, it was impossible, and yet Esperanza believed it was destiny. That night, the feast stretched on. The masters drank deeply, their laughter thick with arrogance. Overseers joined, their whips coiled at their sides like sleeping snakes. Mistress Isabella, dressed in crimson silk, demanded songs from the slaves. Hernando de Lima raised his cup, toasting to wealth and empire. Esperanza moved among them with quiet grace, refilling goblets, clearing plates, her face expressionless. But inside, she measured every detail: which masters were drunkest, where the keys to the chains hung, how close Rodrigo staggered toward unconsciousness with each cup of wine. Every heartbeat brought her closer to the moment. Near midnight, the masters demanded entertainment. They had feasted, drunk, and mocked their slaves enough. Now they wanted spectacle. Hernando, his voice thick with wine, announced that the slaves would perform dances by the furnace's glow. Laughter erupted. What better way to celebrate their power than to force the enslaved to sing and dance before the fire that consumed their lives daily? Esperanza's eyes burned. The gods had delivered her the opportunity. The masters themselves had chosen the furnace as the stage. She gave a silent signal to her allies. They moved swiftly but subtly, guiding the drunken masters toward the great furnace room. The air grew hotter as they approached, the iron beast roaring with flames, sparks leaping into the smoky night sky. The slaves pretended obedience, pretending to prepare for performance. The overseers followed, though some staggered with wine, their discipline dulled by drink. Inside the furnace chamber, the heat was suffocating. The fire glowed red against the walls, shadows dancing wildly. The masters stood in a semicircle, mocking and laughing, waiting for their entertainment. Their wives fanned themselves against the stifling air. The overseers barked orders, ensuring the slaves bowed deeply. But Esperanza did not bow. She straightened, her scarred arms glowing in the firelight, her eyes burning with fury. For the first time, she looked directly at Hernando and Isabella without lowering her gaze. The room grew quieter as her defiance hung in the air. Hernando, irritated, began to bark an order. But before he could speak, Esperanza's voice cut through the heat. "You made us fuel for this fire," she said, her voice steady, cold. "Tonight, the fire will feast on you." At her signal, chaos erupted. Her allies struck with hidden weapons, sharp tools smuggled from the fields, stones, and iron rods taken from the furnace room itself. Overseers, caught off guard and drunk, fell quickly. Rodrigo tried to reach for his whip, but Mateo slammed a shovel into his skull, dropping him lifeless onto the floor. Panic spread among the wives, their screams drowned by the roar of the furnace. The masters, stumbling and unarmed, tried to flee, but Esperanza's group moved with desperate precision. Chains were dragged from the walls, shackles locked, wrists bound. The air filled with the clamor of struggle, shouts, the rattle of chains, the sickening thud of blows. Esperanza herself seized Mistress Isabella by the hair, dragging her toward the furnace doors. Isabella shrieked, clawing at her face, but Esperanza's grip was iron. For every lash, every insult, every night of torment, this was her answer. Within minutes, the unthinkable had happened. 14 masters, along with their wives and overseers, were overpowered and bound. They lay chained, groaning, cursing, their silks stained with dirt and blood. Their arrogance had blinded them, their drunkenness had betrayed them. Now, for the first time, they felt the weight of chains. Esperanza stood over them, her chest heaving, her scarred arms gleaming with sweat. She looked at the furnace, its flames hungrily licking the air. For years it had consumed coal, sugar, and the bodies of broken slaves. Tonight it would consume their masters. But in that moment, as silence fell, a choice still lingered. She could stop. She could show mercy, risk sparing some, perhaps attempt escape with her allies into the mountains. But mercy was a luxury long denied to her people. Mercy had been stripped away with every whip, every burial, every body that hung from a tree. She met the terrified eyes of Hernando de Lima, once her master, now trembling in chains. "This is justice," she said softly. Her allies dragged the bound masters toward the furnace doors. The heat grew unbearable, sweat pouring from every pore. The smell of coal and smoke filled the chamber. Chains rattled as the captives struggled, begging, threatening, sobbing. But their words carried no power now. Esperanza's hands gripped the iron doors. The fire roared louder, as if it knew what was to come. The moment of decision had arrived. And what Esperanza did next would forever carve her name into the annals of fear and vengeance. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed against the chest like a stone. The plantation seemed asleep, overseers drunk in their quarters, the masters deep in their nightly indulgences, and the slaves confined to their huts. But Esperanza de Lima was wide awake, her pulse drumming like war drums in her ears. She rose quietly, every movement deliberate, every step chosen with care. Tonight, the chains of her suffering would shatter in fire. She walked toward the coal furnace with steady hands, though her heart thrashed wildly inside her chest. The furnace glowed faintly, its embers alive but weak after the day's work. Esperanza lifted a shovel and fed the fire more coal, her muscles straining. Sparks leapt upward, scattering like stars in the night. She worked in silence, every breath deep and focused, until the furnace roared to life. Heat pressed against her skin, sweat rolled down her brow, and the crackling flames whispered the promise of vengeance. This furnace had been her cage for years. She had shoveled coal into it until her arms felt broken. She had inhaled its choking smoke until her lungs burned. But tonight, the furnace would become her weapon, her executioner, her ally in rebellion. In the great house, the feast continued. Christmas night stretched into morning, and the masters had grown fat with wine and meat. Their laughter echoed across the plantation, spilling out through open windows into the night. Esperanza could hear it, even over the roar of the fire. Their voices sounded grotesque, like beasts celebrating while their prey starved. Slowly, Esperanza made her move. She left the furnace and slipped into the shadows of the big house. Her bare feet padded against the earth, silent as the wind. She entered through the servants' passage, the one rarely noticed by her captors. Inside, the smell of roasted meat and spilled rum still hung thick in the air. The masters were gathered in the grand hall, slouched in chairs, their faces flushed red from drink. The overseers snored at the edges of the room, their whips coiled on the floor beside them. Candles flickered, casting long shadows across the walls, illuminating faces she had memorized with hate. 14 in all, masters, mistresses, and their overseers. 14 tormentors. 14 flames waiting to be extinguished. Esperanza stepped forward, carrying a heavy iron key she had stolen weeks earlier. It was the key to the furnace chamber, the one room the masters never entered, for the heat was unbearable, the air suffocating. Only the slaves were sent there, and only Esperanza knew its secrets. "Another drink, Esperanza," one of the mistresses slurred, waving her goblet without even looking at her. Her command was a dismissal, a reminder that in their eyes, Esperanza was nothing. But tonight, she was everything. She filled the goblet with wine, her hands calm, though her thoughts burned hotter than the furnace itself. She served them one by one, moving like a ghost through the hall. And then, with a voice steady and low, she said, "The furnace burns hotter tonight. Come, let me show you. It will warm your bones in this cold season." The masters laughed, amused by the thought. They followed her with drunken curiosity, mocking her words, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. The overseers stumbled behind them, whips dragging like tails. They had no fear, why would they? To them, Esperanza was only a slave, incapable of rebellion. But as they descended into the furnace chamber, the air shifted. The heat rose in waves, suffocating and thick. The fire blazed bright, casting a demonic glow across the brick walls. Esperanza stood at the threshold, watching as they entered one by one, 14 shadows swallowed by the furnace's light. "Close the door," one of the masters barked, sweat already forming on his brow. "Too much draft." Esperanza obeyed, or so it seemed. She shut the iron door behind them, sliding the bolt into place. The heavy metal clanged, echoing like a death knell. For a moment, confusion flickered in their eyes. Then realization dawned. They rushed toward the door, shouting, cursing, ordering her to open it. Their fists pounded against the iron, their voices rising in panic. Esperanza stood outside, her back against the door, her breath steady. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. "The fire sings for you." Inside, chaos erupted. They screamed, demanded, begged. The overseers threw their weight against the door, but it would not move. The furnace blazed hotter, devouring oxygen, filling the chamber with smoke. Sweat poured from their bodies, their fine clothes clinging to their skin. Their laughter from earlier turned to shrieks of terror. Esperanza did not waver. She shoveled more coal into the roaring fire, feeding it like a hungry beast. Sparks leapt, flames roared, and the air grew thick with heat. The chamber became a furnace of death, a tomb of fire. The masters clawed at the walls, their nails tearing against brick. The mistresses wept, their voices breaking, promising riches, freedom, mercy, anything for release. But Esperanza remembered every lash of the whip, every burial mound where her kin lay, every child torn from their mother's arms. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. Minutes stretched like hours. The smell of burning flesh seeped through the cracks of the iron door. The screams grew weaker, then faded into silence, until only the roar of the fire remained. 14 lives ended in smoke and flame, swallowed by the furnace they had forced Esperanza to serve. She stood in silence, her chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of what she had done. The plantation was no longer theirs. It was hers. Outside, the slaves stirred in their huts, awakened by the smell of smoke and the echoes of screams. They gathered quietly, unsure of what had happened. When Esperanza emerged from the furnace chamber, covered in soot, her eyes burning with firelight, they knew. She had done the unthinkable, slaughtered the masters who had enslaved them. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, whispers spread like wildfire. "Esperanza. She burned them. She freed us." The air buzzed with fear and awe. Some wept, others fell to their knees, and some raised their fists in quiet triumph. Esperanza said nothing. She looked at them, her people, and for the first time in her life, she felt no chains around her soul. But she knew the night was not over. The flames might have devoured the masters, but their absence would not go unnoticed. By morning, other plantations would hear. Soldiers would come. Blood would spill. Esperanza had won this night, but what came next would test them all. Still, in that moment, she stood tall against the night sky, the furnace roaring behind her, and knew that history would remember the woman who turned fire into freedom. But what became of Esperanza after the fire? Did she escape into legend, or was she hunted down like prey? The aftermath was darker and even more haunting. The dawn after the fire carried a silence so heavy it seemed unnatural. The plantation, once alive with the barking of overseers and the cries of the enslaved, lay still. Smoke curled upward from the coal furnace, its black plume stretching into the pale morning sky. No laughter echoed from the great house. No whip cracked in the fields. The masters were gone, burned, silenced, reduced to ash. Esperanza de Lima stood at the edge of the furnace chamber, her body coated in soot, her eyes hollow yet burning with a strange light. Around her, The enslaved gathered in hushed disbelief. Some covered their mouths in shock, others whispered prayers, and a few wept openly, their tears carrying both sorrow and a dangerous kind of joy. For years, their lives had been dictated by those 14 figures now turned to smoke. Every meal, every lash, every command had come from them. And now, in a single night, Esperanza had undone them all. It was liberation, yes, but it was also terror. Freedom, they knew, was never granted without a price. By noon, word began to spread beyond the plantation. A rider from a neighboring estate, coming to deliver a holiday greeting, found the gates unguarded and the house strangely silent. He smelled the smoke, heard whispers among the slaves, and fled in panic to raise the alarm. Within hours, the colonial authorities knew something unspeakable had happened. The response was swift and merciless. Soldiers marched to the plantation, muskets gleaming in the sun, dogs snarling at their sides. They found the furnace still glowing, the stench of burned flesh thick in the air. When they pried open the iron chamber, what remained of the masters was unrecognizable: charred bones, melted jewelry, blackened skulls. The sight was so grotesque that even hardened soldiers recoiled. Esperanza did not flee. She stood among her people, unchained, her chin lifted high. Some begged her to run into the forest, to vanish into the swamps where fugitives hid. But Esperanza knew the truth. Her act had been too loud, too monumental to escape. If she ran, others would suffer in her place. If she stayed, her defiance would become legend. The soldiers seized her. Chains, heavier than any she had worn before, were clamped onto her wrists and ankles. They dragged her through the plantation yard where she had once bent under the overseer's lash. Now she walked upright, her eyes locked on the horizon, refusing to bow. The trial that followed was little more than a performance. The colonial court demanded a confession, but Esperanza gave them none. They accused her of slaughter, of rebellion, of poisoning the natural order. She stood silent until one magistrate shouted, "Why did you do it?" Then her voice rang clear. "Because the fire was mine before it was theirs. Because we were born in chains, and I chose to burn them. Because no woman, no man, no child deserves to be buried alive in slavery." Gasps filled the court. Some spat at her, others, even among the free onlookers, felt a chill run through their bones. Her sentence was death. They would make an example of her. The governor declared she would be hanged publicly, her body displayed as a warning to any who dared follow her path. The date was set for New Year's morning, so that her death would close the year of fire and begin the next with fear. On the night before her execution, Esperanza sat alone in a stone cell. The air was damp, the walls rough, the only light a thin ray from the moon. She thought of her mother's lullabies, of the songs her people had sung in the fields, of the cries of infants torn from their mothers. She thought of the furnace and the 14 figures who had screamed as fire consumed them. She did not weep. At dawn, the gallows stood ready in the town square. Crowds gathered, drawn by both horror and curiosity. Soldiers lined the streets, their bayonets flashing. The enslaved were forced to watch, dragged from their quarters as a warning. Esperanza was led forward, chains clinking with every step. Yet she walked with the grace of a queen. Her face bore no fear, only defiance. When they placed the noose around her neck, she lifted her gaze to the sky. The crowd fell silent. Her last words rang across the square. "You may hang this body, but the fire has already spread. You cannot kill what is already burning in the hearts of the enslaved." And with that, the platform dropped, her body swung against the morning light, still, but her words lingered, carried in whispers and songs long after the crowd dispersed. The authorities tried to erase her memory, to reduce her to a warning. They buried her body in an unmarked grave outside the town, denying her even the dignity of a name. But stories have a way of surviving. Esperanza's people carried her in their songs, in their prayers whispered under the cover of night. Mothers told their children of the woman who burned the masters alive, who faced the gallows with unbroken spirit. Her act ignited whispers of rebellion across the colonies. In fields and huts, in churches and forests, enslaved men and women spoke her name with awe. Esperanza de Lima became a ghost the masters could not kill, a shadow of fire that haunted their nights. Some said they saw her in the smoke of burning candles at church, others in the sparks of the forge, others in the glow of a hearth at Christmas. Even centuries later, her story lived on, fragmented, whispered, half hidden in fear but never gone. Some remembered her as a savior, others as a monster, but all agreed on one thing. She changed the course of her people's history with fire. In the end, Esperanza's life was short, her death brutal. But her legacy was eternal. She proved that even a woman born in chains could strike terror into the hearts of her oppressors. She showed that vengeance could burn brighter than fear. And though her body was buried, her fire became immortal. Because every spark in every rebellion after her carried her name. Every chain that broke echoed her defiance. And every whisper of freedom was a flame lit by the woman who turned a furnace into a grave for her masters. Esperanza de Lima, slave, daughter, executioner, martyr. The woman who burned 14 plantation owners alive and became the fire no gallows could ever silence.